WBAI, New York. It is 31 minutes after the hour. The Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti and the advocacy organization Bureau des Avocats Internationaux are welcoming the United Nations initiative announced last week to eliminate cholera from Haiti. The initiative supports a joint plan to be announced next month aimed at eliminating cholera on the island of Hispaniola over a 10-year period through healthcare, public education, and clean water and sanitation infrastructure. The plan to eliminate cholera is one of the key remedies sought in legal claims filed just over a year ago against the UN by the two advocacy organizations on behalf of some 5,000 victims of cholera in Haiti. The plaintiffs cite extensive evidence to prove that the outbreak was caused by poor UN sanitation practices, which allowed untreated human waste from soldiers deployed from a cholera endemic country to leak into Haiti's central river system. According to UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, bilateral and multilateral donors have made available some $215 million in existing funds to support the elimination efforts, and the Haitian government is expected to announce additional details of the plan next month in January of 2013. Beatrice Lindstrom is a staff attorney at the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, where she works primarily on litigation seeking accountability from the United Nations for its role in causing Haiti's cholera outbreak. Prior to joining the Institute, she worked for the Bureau des Avocats Internationaux in Haiti, where she worked extensively on housing rights advocacy and on the Health and Human Rights in Prisons project. She is a graduate of New York University School of Law, and she speaks English, Swedish, Korean, French, and Haitian Creole. Good afternoon, Ms. Beatrice Lindstrom.
Good afternoon.
Okay, how profound is the cholera epidemic in Haiti? How many people have been killed? How many people are affected?
It's extremely severe. At this point, in the 2 years since cholera broke out in October of 2010, an estimated 7,800 people have died from cholera, and over 600,000 have fallen ill. And these numbers just represent the people who have actually made it to hospitals or cholera treatment centers, and many people estimate that the true number of people who have been impacted may be as much as twice as high.
Tell me about the lawsuit that the Institute filed last year. You're part of the legal team that filed that lawsuit, correct?
That's right. So we represent 5,000 Haitian victims of cholera, who are people who either have fallen sick themselves and survived cholera, or who have lost family members or their loved ones to this disease. And we helped them file claims with the United Nations in November of 2011. And the claims are seeking three things. Well, I should say first that the main thing that we're seeking is some sort of fair hearing on the victims' claims. Because, of course, the issue that's hanging over all of this is that the UN has signed an agreement with the Haitian government through which it claims broad immunities from legal action. So we're asking the UN for a fair hearing, and in terms of remedies, we're requesting three things. The first is investment in water and sanitation infrastructure to control the epidemic, compensation for the victims, and an apology from the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. Now, where did you file this action?
So we filed it with the UN Peacekeeping Force, MINUSTA, in Haiti, and also with the Secretariat in New York, and we've since heard that the complaint is now pending with the Office of Legal Affairs, which is the UN's legal office, and that they are currently reviewing the claims.
Now, the peacekeeping operation in Haiti is a creation of the United Nations, and the Secretariat in New York is, of course, the headquarters of the United Nations. So are you asking the United Nations then to investigate itself and to come up with a ruling against itself in this matter?
No, what we're asking for is for there to be established some sort of independent tribunal that can hear this matter in accordance with international law standards of due process. So that would include an independent fact finder who could review the evidence and make a decision independent from the UN. And this is actually something that the UN has already agreed to, in theory at least, and in that same agreement that I mentioned earlier, there is a clause that calls for the establishment of what's called a Standing Claims Commission. But that's never been established in Haiti, and it's never been established anywhere in the world, really, where there is a peacekeeping operation, despite the fact that this is a very standard clause that exists in most treaties that the UN signs when it sends peacekeeping troops into a host country.
Okay, so let's talk about the announcement by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon last week about this initiative that is going to. What do you make of the announcement? First, refresh our memory on what this initiative will involve.
Sure. So it's the launch of an initiative by the Secretary General in support of a plan that's going to be launched this January by the government of Haiti. The plan itself is for eliminating cholera in Haiti over a 10-year period, and what was launched last week is an effort by the Secretary General to support fundraising and implementation of that plan. So at this point, it was announced last week that there's $215 million available in existing funds to support this effort, and that the UN itself is committing $23.5 million. That represents about 10% of the total that the government estimates is going to be needed over this 10-year period. So while it's certainly an important first step and one that does reflect one of the key remedies that we sought in our claims with the UN, it's at this point a tentative step, and much more needs to be done to ensure that justice is provided for, especially for those people who have already lost everything to cholera.
Mm-hmm. Now, is this 215 million plus 23 million from the UN and 215 million from 215 million from donors? Is that money in the bank, or is that money that still has to be raised?
That's money that has been pledged. It's not clear to me whether it's already been delivered to Haiti or not. But it is money that we've been told is now available. But again, that only represents 10%, so there's still a whole lot of fundraising that needs to be done to ensure that this plan really gets off the ground and that it can be implemented fully.
Now, what do we know about the likelihood of being able to raise this $2.2 billion over the next 10 years? It's by any standard, I think that's a fairly substantial amount of money. And the track record doesn't seem to indicate that it is very easy to raise that kind of money for developing countries, even when the need is as desperate as it is in Haiti.
Yeah, I think it's certainly going to be a challenge, and a lot of it, I think, will depend on political will. It is a large amount of money, but it's also important to note that the total amount that is going to be needed to eliminate cholera by providing access to water and sanitation is about as much as the UN spends in a 2-year period on its peacekeeping forces. And of course, Haiti doesn't have a war, it doesn't have an active armed conflict, but it does have a very real cholera problem. So if that money could be reinvested in water and sanitation, I think that would go far further in terms of saving lives and ensuring long-term peace and development in Haiti. It's also important to note that one of the things that was clearly missing from the announcement last week was any kind of acknowledgement of the UN's role in bringing cholera to Haiti. And I think there's a very practical need to accept responsibility, because with that responsibility also comes an obligation to make funding available. And the UN, of course, is in a unique position as such a large organization with so much capital and so much influence and relationships with member states that if the UN were to come out and accept responsibility, I think that would open up the doors for ensuring that funding becomes fully available for this plan.
Could the Secretary General make the argument that by virtue of having made this public announcement, by virtue of having launched this initiative, by virtue of having taken a leadership position on this issue in the international community, that the UN is already doing everything that it could possibly do to remedy this problem, and that a public admission of responsibility does not advance that cause one way or the other?
I think that's essentially the position that the UN has taken from what we've seen in recent months. But it's also very telling that nobody seems to be satisfied with that. Everybody is asking in the media and in terms of the general public response to this, there's been a lot of attention to the fact that there hasn't actually been an acceptance of responsibility. And I think the effect of that is to deny Haitians their human rights and the feeling, there's a real feeling on the ground in Haiti that their dignity has really been offended through this process, and that it's something that the UN doesn't take seriously. There's a whole lot more that the UN can and should do to ensure that justice is provided. That especially is true for those people who have already lost their loved ones, their breadwinners. We work with clients who have used their entire life savings to retrieve. One woman had to retrieve her father's body from a mass grave and provide him with a proper burial, and to do that had to spend her entire life savings. And these people they're very desperate for just basic compensation to ensure that they can get back on their feet and provide their families with food and clean water and basic necessities. And in any justice system, those are things that would be provided to victims of such a reckless act. And of course, the UN itself is very much a promoter of these principles that people should have access to justice. So we are urging the UN to take those principles and put them into practice and ensure that the UN doesn't end up operating outside of the rule of law.
We're talking with Beatrice Lindstrom. She is a human rights lawyer and a staff attorney at the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, where she works primarily on litigation seeking accountability from the United Nations for its role in causing Haiti's cholera outbreak. We're discussing that cholera outbreak, its effects, its consequences, and the campaign for some form of compensatory justice or reparative justice for those persons with thousands, 7,800 people already killed by this cholera outbreak, 600,000 or more affected. And we can take some of your questions for Ms. Lindstrom on this issue. We've got a temporary telephone number. It is 917-580-6020. So you might like to make a note of that, since it's a different number from the one to which you're accustomed. We are still here in Lower Manhattan ailing from the effects of Hurricane Sandy, as a result of which Verizon has not yet restored our regular telephone service. So we're using this temporary telephone number. It's 917-580-6020. And we can take some of your questions about the cholera outbreak in Haiti for our guest, Beatrice Lindstrom, who is a human rights lawyer and staff attorney at the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. 917-580-6020. Let's talk for a moment about compensation, Ms. Lindstrom. What, in your view, would be an appropriate level of compensation, and how would that would it be an equal amount of money, for example, for each person in this class of 5,000, or would it differ from person to person? How do you envisage this?
Well, of course, the truth is that there's no amount of money that really can compensate for the loss of a loved one. But at the same time, it is so critical that basic compensation is provided so that people, at least to some extent, can be made whole again from an economic standpoint, to ensure that they are able to replace the loss of income that may have resulted if it was a breadwinner who passed away as a result of cholera, children who aren't able to go to school and therefore aren't able to pursue an income. Things like that are really important to take into account. There are many different ways that these types of mass-scale injuries are dealt with on an international level. And in certain instances, it's determined that it does make sense to calculate compensation based on what each individual is needing and what they lost. And in other cases, it's standard practice to provide a standard amount for each victim so that you don't have to go through the very lengthy process of calculating compensation. And I think in this case, because there's so many claimants, we're asking for $50,000 for each person who was injured by cholera, and $100,000 for each person who has lost a family member due to cholera. And just to put it in perspective, here in the U.S., the average that a plaintiff gets in a wrongful death suit tends to be around $7 million. So it's really not an outrageous amount of money that we're asking for here, but it is so important so that people can restore some sense of normalcy to their lives and to simply be able to survive this.
Okay, I suppose someone might make the argument that whereas the average amount of money that the average person gets in the U.S. in a wrongful death suit would be $7 million, there are probably not that many $7 million awards at any given time. You're dealing here with a class of 5,000 people all at once. What does the total compensation package look like based on your calculations?
We actually don't have that number available to the public right now,
okay.
Simply because there's some level of confidentiality that we have to keep with our clients, but it does range in the $1 billion.
Okay. Now, let's take a question for you, and then I want to return to more of this issue of money, because in this case, this is an action that is filed against the United Nations, which does not have its own independent economy. All of the money that the United Nations has is money that is contributed by its member states. So ultimately, one is asking the 193 member states of the United Nations, with the exception of Haiti, to foot the bill for this for this compensation. Correct?
That is correct, but it's actually something that member states have already agreed to do.
Okay.
The UN has passed resolutions for decades now that have reaffirmed the principle that when there is harm that results during the course of UN peacekeeping, that there will be compensation that's provided for that, and that member states will come together and ensure that that money is made available.
Okay, let's take some questions for you. Good afternoon, TalkBack. You're on the air with attorney Beatrice Lindstrom. Hello.
Hi. Good afternoon, Ms. Lindstrom. My name is Ms. Placide, and I'm Haitian American, and I've been to Haiti prior to the quake and after the quake. My question about immediate issues, what's being done to prevent any further contamination with the cholera, and as far as plumbing, modernizing plumbing and things like that in Haiti, and also would there be support from, I think it's called CARICOM, like other Caribbean nations, to sort of put pressure on the UN? Is that possible as well? And I'll listen to your answer.
Thank you, Ms. Placide. Ms. Lindstrom.
Sure. So lately, I think ever since the outbreak, the focus has very much been on saving lives as opposed to prevention. There's been a fair bit of focus on education to ensure that people know to wash their hands, to use latrines, to boil water. But of course, those efforts are of limited success when people simply don't have the very financial means to go out and buy soap or to even access a toilet. And so there's much more that needs to be done by way of prevention. This plan that is going to be launched this January, I believe, will focus on those aspects. From what we've heard so far, the preliminary plans are for the first 2 years to focus mostly on vaccinations and mitigation efforts to ensure that the spread of cholera from one person to another is limited and that we protect people from contracting cholera. But then there's a much broader long-term effort of putting in place water and sanitation, and that piece is really key to ensuring that this isn't an ongoing problem in Haiti. And I think all international actors that are active on this matter agree that until there is water and sanitation in Haiti, cholera will continue to be a problem. And so ensuring that people have access to clean water is going to be a huge focus over the next 10 years, and something that we will continue to monitor and ensure that it's something that is prioritized and that is implemented in a way that really results in improved access to water and sanitation.
We're talking with Beatrice Lindstrom, staff attorney at the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. Our number here is 917-580-6020. It's our temporary emergency number here at WBAI. If you'd like to be on the air and part of this conversation, the number is 917-580-6020. Good afternoon. You are on the air. Hello. Hello, you're on.
Yes, hello.
Yes.
Well, thanks for accepting my call, and I also want to thank the lady for her great work and important work in the Haitian community.
Right. Could you speak up a bit, please?
Yes. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. My question for her was she mentioned, I don't know if it was her or you that mentioned that the Haitian government signed a contract with the United Nations, like some sort of an agreement that they would not be responsible for anything. I'm not really too sure exactly what that agreement was. If it was like some sort of agreement to like ditch any responsibility for what happened.
Okay, Ms. Lindstrom, did you get that question?
I did, yes.
Okay, yes, please go ahead.
That agreement is called the Status of Forces Agreement, and it was signed in 2004 when the MINUSTA peacekeeping troops were first deployed to Haiti. And it doesn't at all state anything about, it doesn't excuse the UN from taking responsibility. It quite does the opposite, and ensures that there still will be mechanisms through which victims can seek compensation when they have been harmed because of UN peacekeeping or during the course of UN peacekeeping. What the agreement does do, though, is it has a provision that provides for immunity from legal action in Haitian courts. And so it's an interesting agreement because while there is that immunity, it does also balance it out by saying that the UN will provide for a way for victims to access remedies, but it's the implementation of that hasn't happened. So even though there's an agreement in place that obligates the UN and the Haitian government to work together to ensure that there is some access to justice for victims, that just hasn't happened in practice. And so what we're asking for the UN to do is to follow through on that agreement and put in place a mechanism that would allow victims to come forward and file their claims and have their claims investigated and reviewed, and the ability to then finally get a remedy out of that process.
Do you know, that bit of history reminds me that, of course, this coming January would mark the third anniversary, I believe, of the devastating earthquake in Haiti that on January 12th that killed more than 250,000 people and displaced hundreds and hundreds of thousands of other people, many of whom continue to be displaced in Haiti. And many of our listeners who are not intimately familiar with the history of Haiti are probably thinking that this much of this goes back, is traceable to the earthquake. But you just reminded us that MINUSTA was first deployed in Haiti in 2004. Remind us of why the UN deployed a peacekeeping presence in Haiti in 2004 in the first place, and then walk us through the process that led to this outbreak of cholera, which has been traced to the Nepalese component of the peacekeeping deployment.
Right. So UN peacekeepers were deployed to Haiti in 2004, shortly after a coup that removed President Aristide from power. And Haiti is a very unique case because it's one of the only, if not the only, cases in the world where a UN peacekeeping force has been deployed to a country to essentially help stabilize an environment after and reinforce a government that was put in place as a result of the coup that removed a democratically elected president. So the origins of MINUSTA in Haiti are very controversial, and I think Haitians very strongly feel that this is not a legitimate use of resources, that the presence of MINUSTA in Haiti is very complex and not always something that's welcomed. Many people feel that it's an occupying force that makes it more difficult for the government to act autonomously. And so it's in that context that this cholera epidemic took place. And of course, it's not the first time that there's been issues around accountability with peacekeepers. This is a broader issue that takes place not only in Haiti, but everywhere around the world where there are peacekeeping operations. And because there isn't a good accountability system in place, you will have oftentimes instances of acts of sexual violence that are committed, oftentimes against women or girls or young boys, where the perpetrators of that violence are then sent back home to be tried in their home country, and oftentimes the home country may not have the capacity or the will to try these people, and so they essentially end up getting off scot-free. And I think that it's a huge issue that's been recognized within the UN as something that the UN needs to deal more effectively with. And this cholera outbreak takes place in that context, and really goes to this broader issue of how we're going to ensure that when the UN operates in host countries, that it is accountable for wrongs that occur during the course of those operations.
Okay, and now this outbreak of cholera has been traced specifically to Nepalese peacekeeping troops. Am I correct?
That's right.
Okay, now how is the UN responsible if peacekeeping troops that have been deployed as part of this larger operation from a country where cholera is known to exist, how are they responsible for the fact that untreated waste from these peacekeeping troops, originally from Nepal, was allowed into the river system? Could the UN, in other words, make the argument that, look, this is as much a function of poverty and infrastructural underdevelopment as it is of the failure on the part of the peacekeepers to be mindful of waste disposal procedures?
Yeah, so cholera was brought to Haiti through Nepalese soldiers. They were deployed from Nepal at a time when Nepal itself was experiencing a horrible cholera epidemic, although of a much, much smaller scale than what is now taking place in Haiti. And the frustrating part of this is, of course, that at the time it was 10 months after the earthquake, and everybody was talking about waterborne disease as the big issue that we had to be careful with. We had to ensure that that there wasn't a waterborne disease outbreak in Haiti, because the effects of that would be devastating. So it was very well known to the UN that this was a major problem that had to be prevented. These peacekeepers were deployed to Haiti and were not tested or treated for cholera, and that was something that was a part of UN protocol. So it was not just Nepalese protocol, but the Nepalese army was following UN protocol when it didn't test these peacekeepers. They were then stationed on a base that maintained horrible sanitation practices and allowed for human waste that was untreated to leak into Haiti's central river system. Of course, Haiti's weak infrastructure has made it so that cholera could spread very quickly, and people have very little protection from contracting cholera. But that can't be used as an excuse for the negligence and recklessness that allowed for cholera to come to Haiti in the first place.
Ms. Lindstrom, I want to thank you very much for what has been a very enlightening conversation here this afternoon. Before you go, though, please tell listeners how they can be supportive of your efforts and of the efforts of the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti.
Well, I think there's a lot of information available about our case and the ongoing efforts to hold the UN accountable, and that information is available on our website at www.ijdh.org. That's ijdh.org. And there's also links there to a current petition that's circulating. It was started by filmmaker Oliver Stone, and so far 7,800 people from all around the world have joined that petition to call on the UN to do more. And we also continue to post on our website about various ways that general citizens can get involved in calling on the UN to do more in response to this cholera epidemic.
Beatrice Lindstrom is a human rights lawyer and a staff attorney at the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, where she works primarily on litigation seeking accountability from the United Nations for its role in causing Haiti's cholera outbreak. Thank you very much, Ms. Lindstrom.
Thank you very much.